Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back to the 19th century, to the long reign of Queen Victoria. It was an era so famously buttoned up, so notoriously proper, that its name has become a synonym for being no fun at all. But, as you know, here on this channel, we like to look under the floorboards of history, and tonight we're prying open a big one. We're going to explore what was really going on behind all those closed curtains and stiff upper lips. Frankly, if you were dropped into this world, the sheer, crushing weight of all the rules might get you before the cholera does. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. While you're at it, let me know in the comments what city are you listening from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where we're all journeying from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a room. Take a deep breath. The air is thick with the faint, sweet smell of beeswax, coal smoke, and something else, a kind of heavy, fabric-dusted stillness. You're in a respectable middle-class parlor. And it is alert. Every surface is draped, covered, or decorated. Heavy velvet curtains block out most of the afternoon light, and the wallpaper has a pattern so dense you feel like the walls are slowly creeping in on you. There's a fireplace, of course, with a mantelpiece so crowded with porcelain figurines, framed family portraits, and brass knickknacks that another item would surely cause a catastrophe. It's a room designed to display status, but its side effect is a feeling of gentle, decorative suffocation. Your own clothes don't help. The collar on your shirt is stiffened high, a constant reminder to keep your chin up. Literally. Your eyes drift across the room, past the chaise lounge and the bell jar containing a rather gloomy-looking taxidermy bird. You land on the piano. It's a handsome instrument, dark wood polished to a high sheen, but something is odd about it. The sturdy, carved legs of the piano are wearing tiny, frilly trousers, little fabric pantalettes, tied with ribbons, covering them from the keyboard down to the floor. You have to blink a few times to make sure you're seeing it right. In this world you've just stepped into. The very idea of a leg is considered a bit scandalous. It's too suggestive of a human limb, too anatomical. In polite, mixed company, one would refer to them as limbs. This is our first, and perhaps most famous, glimpse into the Victorian mind. The obsession with modesty was so profound that it extended to inanimate objects, just in case a bare table leg might spark an impure thought in a gentleman's mind. Now, that famous story about covering piano legs, historians still go back and forth on just how widespread this really was. Was it a common practice in every middle-class home, a genuine reflection of societal anxiety, or was it more of an urban legend, an exaggeration that later generations, like ours, used to mock the Victorians for their prudishness? The consensus among many academics today is that it probably happened, but it was likely more of a fad in certain circles or a satirical joke that got taken a bit too seriously. It represents a kind of peak absurdity of the era's public performance of propriety. The very fact that the story exists and was believable tells you everything you need to know about the atmosphere of the time. This verbal and visual dance around the human body extended everywhere. Imagine being invited to dinner. You're seated at a long, formal table. When the roasted chicken is served, you can't simply ask for a leg or a thigh. Oh no, that would be terribly coarse. Instead, you would politely request dark meat or white meat. The bird, like the piano, had been stripped of its anatomy through language. This wasn't just about sex, it was about erasing the body itself. With all its messy, animalistic reality, the body was something to be managed, clothed, disciplined, and certainly not mentioned in casual conversation. This intense public prudery created a powerful pressure cooker. If you spend all day pretending that bodies don't really exist, what happens at night, what happens behind closed doors? When the performance of politeness is over, the greater the public repression, the more elaborate the private world of desire tends to become. You can feel it in this quiet, overstuffed room, a silence that isn't peaceful, but full of things left unsaid. Every covered leg, every hushed-up word is a testament to a deep, societal anxiety about the very nature of being human. And you've just arrived. You can feel the weight of 1,000 unspoken rules pressing down on you, and you haven't even met your host yet. The heady silence of the parlor is broken by a soft rustle of fabric. A woman has entered the room so quietly you didn't even hear the door open. This must be your host's wife. She is the living embodiment of the room's aesthetic, modest, serene, and impeccably presented. Her dress is a sober gray silk, with a delicate lace collar fastened high at her throat. Her hair is parted neatly in the center and coiled into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. There isn't a single stray wisp. She smiles, but it's a gentle, contained expression that doesn't quite reach her eyes. She moves not with confidence, but with a kind of practiced grace, as if she is gliding through a series of carefully memorized steps. She is, you realize, the chief ornament in this over-decorated room. This woman is aspiring to a very specific and very powerful ideal of the time. She is trying to be the angel in the house. That phrase comes from a wildly popular narrative poem by a man named Coventry Patmore, which described the perfect wife. And let me tell you, the job description was demanding. The angel in the house was expected to be utterly selfless, eternally patient, and morally pure. Her entire existence was dedicated to creating a peaceful, comfortable, and righteous home for her husband and children. She was the emotional and spiritual anchor of the family, a human sanctuary to which her husband could retreat from the grimy, corrupting world of business and politics. She managed the servants, soothed fevers, arranged the flowers, and did it all with a gentle smile, never once complaining or expressing a selfish desire. On paper, it sounded beautiful, didn't it? She was to be the sacred heart of the home. But as you watch her portray, her movements precise, her posture perfect, you begin to sense the immense pressure behind the performance. Here's a cold little fact about the angel's life for most of the Victorian era. Once a woman married, she legally ceased to exist. Under a legal doctrine called coverture, a wife was considered the property of her husband, her own property. Any inheritance she brought into the marriage, any wages she might earn, it all belonged to him. She couldn't sign a contract, couldn't sue someone in court, and had no legal claim to her own children. She was, in the eyes of the law, a ghost, a possession. The very house she so lovingly managed was not hers. The beautiful porcelain teacup she's now handing you is not hers. Even the modest dress she wears is, legally speaking, his. Her entire identity was covered by her husband's. So, you look at this serene angel and you have to wonder, how much of this angelic patience is genuine, and how much is a necessary survival strategy? This is a question historians still debate passionately. Did the majority of middle-class Victorian women really internalize this ideal, believing it was their divine and natural purpose to be selfless and submissive, or was it a mask, worn to maintain peace in a world where they had virtually no power? The truth, as always, is probably a messy combination of both. For some, the role of the angel likely provided a genuine sense of purpose and moral authority within their limited sphere. They ruled the domestic world, and that was a form of power. But the private diaries and letters of other women from the period tell a different story. They speak of a profound sense of isolation, of being smothered, of a restlessness they couldn't name. They write about mysterious headaches, fainting spells, and long bouts of nervous exhaustion. This state of permanent, low-grade depression was so common, it was almost considered a normal part of being a woman. The angel in the house was meant to have no desires of her own, especially not physical ones. Her body was for bearing children and being an elegant, non-threatening presence. Any hint of passion or ambition was seen as a sign of a flawed, even unwomanly, character. as she asks about your journey in a soft, musical voice. You realize you're talking to someone who has been trained from birth to erase herself. Her education, her clothes, her prescribed duties, everything was designed to sand down her sharp edges, to quiet her own voice, and to mold her into this perfect, pleasing shape. She is both a victim and a gatekeeper of this system. She will, in turn, raise her own daughters to become angels, and her sons to expect them. You take a sip of your tea. It's perfectly brewed, of course, but there's a bitter aftertaste you can't quite place. It's the taste of a life lived entirely for others, in a gilded cage of comfort and crippling expectation. The angel of the house mentions her daughter, who will be joining you for tea shortly. She speaks of her with a mixture of pride and a certain strategic anxiety. Her daughter has just turned 18. She is now officially out in society, which means the most important and stressful campaign of her young life has begun: the hunt for a suitable husband. You're about to witness firsthand the bizarre and deeply unromantic ritual that was Victorian courtship. The whole process was less of a romance and more of a high-stakes business negotiation, conducted under the constant, unblinking supervision of a chaperone. A younger woman enters the room. She is bright-eyed and her cheeks are flushed, a stark contrast to her mother's pale composure. Yet she is dressed just as modestly, and her movements are just as practiced. She curtsies, her eyes cast demurely downwards. You are a hypothetical suitor, a young man of good standing who has been formally introduced to the family. Now, the game begins. You want to talk to her, to get to know her, but you can't just talk to her. Not alone. Her mother, the chaperone, will be present for every single interaction. She will sit in the parlor with you, knitting quietly but missing nothing. Her presence is a silent, yet unreachable wall, ensuring that no inappropriate topics are discussed and, heaven forbid, no unsupervised physical contact occurs. So you try to have a conversation, but what can you even talk about? You can discuss the weather. That's always a safe bet. You can talk about a new book of poetry, as long as it's not by Lord Byron, who was considered far too scandalous. You could perhaps discuss a recent concert or a public lecture on the wonders of steam power, but you cannot ask her what she dreams of. You cannot ask her what she thinks about the world, or politics, or anything of substance. Those are not feminine topics. Your conversation is a carefully choreographed dance, full of polite inanities and coded language. You are essentially trying to assess a person's entire character based on their ability to discuss rainfall and watercolor painting. If you want to spend more time with her, you might invite her and her mother for a walk in the park. This was a classic Victorian date. The three of you would stroll along a designated public promenade. The daughter would be strategically placed between you and her mother, creating a human buffer zone. Your proximity would be carefully monitored. A hand lingering too long on her elbow while helping her over a puddle could be cause for a minor scandal. Here's a quirky little detail from the period: a whole industry of etiquette manuals existed, with pages and pages dedicated to the rules of public courtship. One popular guide advised that a gentleman should never walk on the same side of the pavement as the lady for more than a few minutes, lest onlookers think the relationship was becoming too familiar. You were supposed to switch sides periodically, like a weird, formal game of leapfrog. The real communication, of course, was happening between you and the parents. Your own father has probably already had a very serious chat with her father. They would have discussed your finances, your career prospects, your family background, and any potential hereditary diseases. Historians are still trying to map the intricate web of social connections and financial interests that drove these matches. Was it all a cold, calculated transaction? Or did genuine affection manage to bloom in these sterile environments? The answer seems to be that while the framework was deeply pragmatic, people still found ways to express real emotion. They had to get creative. A glance held for a second too long. The accidental dropping of a handkerchief for you to retrieve. The most famous tool for this clandestine communication was the fan. A young lady could hold an entire conversation with you from across a crowded ballroom using only her fan. Snapping it shut meant, "I wish to speak with you." Fanning slowly meant, "I am married," or "I am engaged." Fanning quickly could signal, "I love you." There were dozens of these signals. It was a silent, secret language, a tiny rebellion against the suffocating presence of the chaperone. You watch the daughter as she listens to her mother and you chat about the weather. Her expression is perfectly neutral, but her fingers tap restlessly on her teacup. You wonder what she would say if she could speak freely. You wonder if she's even allowed to know what her own heart wants. In a world that has already decided what she needs: a respectable husband, a comfortable home, and a future as the next angel in the house, the whole ritual feels less like the beginning of a love story and more like the gentle, polite closing of a cage door. Time fast forwards. The awkward walks, the chaperone tease, the fan language flirtations, they all lead to this. A formal proposal, a parental agreement, and a modest church wedding. Now, you stand in the threshold of your new bedroom. It's your wedding night. The room is dark, lit only by a single flickering gas lamp turned down low. The air is cool and smells faintly of lavender water. Your new wife is already in the room, waiting for you. She is wearing a simple, high-necked white nightgown that covers her from throat to ankles. She sits on the edge of the bed, her hands folded primly in her lap. Her posture is straight and still as a statue. She doesn't look at you. Her gaze is fixed on a point on the far wall. This is the moment that all of Victorian society, with its layers of rules and repression, has been leading up to. But there is no sense of joyful culmination here. There is no passion, no eager anticipation. The silence in the room is heavy and full of a profound, unspoken awkwardness. For a respectable middle-class woman like your wife, this moment is likely terrifying. She has been taught her entire life that her body is a private, almost shameful thing. She's been conditioned to believe that desire and physical pleasure are coarse, masculine traits. She has likely received no practical information about what is about to happen. Her mother might have given her a vague, euphemistic talk about her wifely duty, but the conversation would have been brief, clinical, and deeply uncomfortable. The prevailing medical and social belief was that good women did not feel sexual pleasure. Any enjoyment of the act was seen as a sign of a potentially debased or even deranged character, linking her more with a fallen woman than with a proper wife. So, here she is, about to perform a duty for which she has been given no instruction manual, and from which she is expected to derive no pleasure. For her, this is not an act of love or intimacy. It is a clinical, and perhaps even frightening, obligation. It's a part of the marriage contract, performed solely for the purpose of procreation. The goal is to produce a male heir to carry on your name and inherit your property. Romance and mutual satisfaction were simply not part of the equation. As the husband, your own experience is colored by this bizarre cultural landscape. You, too, are likely a product of an all-boys boarding school where the subject was either ignored or treated as a source of shame. You've been raised to see women as one of two types: the pure, untouchable angel you marry, or the fallen woman you might secretly visit for pleasure. Now, you have to reconcile these two opposing ideas in your own marriage bed. How do you approach your angel with desires you've been taught are base and carnal? The act itself was often performed with as much efficiency and as little romance as possible. Here's a strange and telling detail: some marriage advice manuals from the period suggested that the husband should try to be as quick and discreet as possible, and that both parties should remain clothed to the greatest extent manageable. It was not uncommon for a husband and wife to perform this duty in near total darkness, in silence, and with minimal physical contact, sometimes through specially designed nightgowns. The entire experience was framed as a medical event, not a romantic one. And here lies one of those points that historians still explore: how much did this cold, clinical ideal actually reflect the private reality of millions of married couples While the official narrative was one of female passionlessness and dutiful procreation, private letters and diaries sometimes hint at a more complex picture. Some couples clearly did find genuine affection and intimacy, but the dominant cultural script was so powerful that even expressing those feelings, or admitting to enjoying them, would have felt like a transgression. The idea of a wife initiating intimacy or expressing her own desires would have been almost unthinkable, and likely seen by her husband as shocking or even a sign of illness. You look at your new wife, sitting so still on the edge of the bed. You are both trapped in the same strange performance. She is supposed to be passive and endure, you are supposed to be efficient and restrained. The culture has built a wall of silence and shame right down the middle of your marriage bed. This cold, clinical transaction is the hidden core of the Victorian family, the secret engine that keeps the whole system of property, inheritance, and social status running. It's the ultimate expression of the era's deep discomfort with the human body and its desires. A duty to be performed, an heir to be secured, and then, presumably, a return to the safety of separate, emotional worlds. The flickering gaslight casts long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the silence in the room feel even deeper. Several months have passed since your wedding night. The routine of married life has settled in. You perform your duties in the world of commerce, and your wife performs hers as the angel in the house. The home is immaculate, the meals are punctual, and a quiet, orderly peace reigns. But you've started to notice something is off. Your wife seems listless. She often complains of a general malaise, a feeling of fatigue that never quite lifts. She has sudden bouts of weeping for no apparent reason, followed by periods of irritability. Sometimes she mentions a feeling of breathlessness, or a strange sensation of a lump in her throat. She has lost her appetite, and just prone to fits of melancholic silence that can last for hours. You are concerned. Naturally, you consult your family physician, a stern-looking man with impressive sideburns and an air of absolute authority. You describe your wife's symptoms, the anxiety, the sadness, the nervous sensibility. The doctor nods sagely, his expression showing no surprise at all. He has seen this 1,000 times. After a brief and rather dismissive examination of your wife, in which he asks you most of the questions, he delivers his diagnosis. It is a clear case of hysteria, he announces, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Hysteria. You've heard the term. Of course. It's a catch-all diagnosis for almost any emotional or physical ailment in a woman that a doctor couldn't otherwise explain. It was considered an exclusively female condition, as common in the 19th century as diagnosing someone with stress is today. The very word hysteria comes from the Greek hystere, meaning uterus or womb. The ancient Greeks believed that the womb was a free-floating organ, an animal within an animal, that could wander around a woman's body causing all sorts of chaos. If it moved up, it could cause suffocation and fainting. If it got stuck somewhere else, it could cause paralysis or emotional outbursts. By the Victorian era, doctors had moved on from the wandering womb theory, but only just. The womb was still seen as the root of all female problems. The prevailing medical theory, promoted by influential physicians, was that hysteria was caused by a kind of sexual frustration or a malfunctioning of the female reproductive system. A woman's nervous system was considered inherently weaker and more volatile than a man's, and her emotions were thought to be directly controlled by her uterus. Therefore, any behavior that deviated from the angel in the house ideal, too much education, too much reading of novels, not enough children, or even too many children, could upset this delicate system and led to a case of hysteria. The list of potential symptoms was enormous and comically vague. It could include anything from fainting, insomnia, and muscle spasms to irritability, loss of appetite, and a tendency to cause trouble. This is a point where modern historians and medical experts look back with a kind of horrified fascination. The diagnosis of hysteria was, in many ways, a tool for social control. It was a convenient medical label for any woman who wasn't coping well with her restrictive role. Was a woman frustrated by her lack of autonomy? Was she bored and intellectually starved? Was she depressed by the suffocating silence of her life? She wasn't struggling with legitimate social and existential problems. She was simply hysterical. Her suffering was not a valid response to an oppressive environment, but a personal, biological failing. Her womb was acting up. A pathologized female descendant turned a social problem into a medical one. Daba's lesser-known aspect of this was the belief that even the act of reading could be dangerous for women. Doctors seriously argued that reading sensational novels could overstimulate a woman's delicate imagination and nervous system, leading directly to hysteria, or in some cases, even nymphomania. Public libraries sometimes had separate, safe reading lists for their female patrons to prevent them from getting their hands on anything too exciting. The doctor looks at you and your pale, silent wife. He assures you that the condition is common and, thankfully, treatable. He recommends a course of regular treatment to relieve the pelvic congestion that is surely the source of the problem. He suggests your wife begin visiting his office once a week. The treatment, he explains in a low, clinical tone, will restore the womb to its proper function and calm her agitated nerves. You agree, relieved that there is a scientific solution. Your wife says nothing. She just stares at her hands, her expression unreadable. She is about to enter one of the strangest and most disturbing corners of Victorian medical practice. A week later, you find yourself accompanying your wife to the doctor's office for her first treatment. The office is what you'd expect: shelves of leather-bound medical books, glass cabinets filled with intimidating metal instruments, and that distinct, antiseptic smell of carbolic acid. The doctor greets you both with professional detachment, then politely asks you to wait in the receiving area while he begins the procedure. You sit down, picking up an old copy of The Lancet, and try not to think too much about it. Your wife is led into a private examination room. It's a small, windowless space, dominated by a padded table covered with a white sheet. The doctor closes the door behind them. He instructs her to lie down on the table, assuring her in a calm, clinical voice that this is a standard medical procedure, performed for therapeutic purposes only. He might cover her with a sheet to preserve some semblance of modesty. Then, the treatment begins. The doctor applies a lubricant, often a simple oil, or salve, to his hands and proceeds to perform a pelvic massage. This was the medically sanctioned cure for hysteria. The goal, as described in medical textbooks of the day, was to manually stimulate the patient's pelvic region in order to induce a hysterical paroxysm. Let's be clear about what that means. The doctor would massage the patient, sometimes for up to an hour, until she experienced an orgasm. In the bizarre logic of Victorian medicine, this was not a sexual act. Not at all. It was a clinical procedure to relieve the supposed congestion and fluid backup in the womb that was causing her hysterical symptoms. The female orgasm was not understood as a pleasurable release, but as a convulsive, almost seizure-like event that purged the body of its nervous energy and restored balance. The fact that the patient might feel better afterwards, calmer, more relaxed, was taken as proof that the treatment was working. She was cured, at least until the symptoms returned and she needed another session. You can only imagine the experience from your wife's perspective, lying there, in a cold, silent room, while a man she barely knows, a figure of immense authority, performs this incredibly intimate act. She has been taught her whole life to suppress and deny her own physical feelings, and now they are being mechanically produced by a doctor as a form of medicine. The experience must have been a profoundly confusing and alienating mix of shame, discomfort, and physiological response. There was no language for her to process this. It was medical, therefore it was not personal. It was a cure, therefore it was not abuse. The entire framework was designed to strip the act of any emotional or personal meaning. This practice was incredibly widespread. For doctors, it was a routine and rather tedious part of their job. In fact, many physicians complained in their private journals about how time-consuming and physically demanding it was. Getting a patient to the point of paroxysm could take a very long time, and it often left the doctor with a sore hand and an aching wrist. This wasn't some fringe, quack doctor treatment. It was mainstream medicine, practiced by respected physicians across Europe and North America for decades. Here's where the historical debate gets particularly interesting. Some historians argue that this practice represents one of the most profound examples of medical misogyny, where female sexuality was so misunderstood and pathologized that it was turned into a disease to be mechanically cured by men. Others, however, present a more nuanced view, suggesting that for some women, these treatments might have been the only socially acceptable way to experience any form of sexual release in a deeply repressive society. It's a complex and uncomfortable idea. Did some women consciously or unconsciously use the diagnosis of hysteria to seek out a physical experience they were otherwise denied? We can never truly know the internal motivations of these patients. The records are all written from the doctor's perspective, clinical and detached. After what feels like an eternity, the door to the examination room opens. The doctor emerges, looking professional but perhaps a little tired. He washes his hands in a basin. A few moments later, your wife comes out. Her face is flushed, her hair slightly disheveled. She won't meet your eyes. The doctor informs you that the first treatment was successful, and that with regular sessions, he expects her condition to improve significantly. You pay his fee. On the carriage ride home, your wife is silent. She stares out the window at the passing streets. You ask her if she feels better. She gives a small, almost imperceptible nod, but the air between you is thick with a new kind of silence, one that is colder and more complicated than before. The weekly trips to the doctor's office become a fixture in your life. You notice a pattern. After each treatment, your wife is indeed calmer for a day or two, but her underlying listlessness and anxiety always return, sometimes worse than before. The doctor insists this is normal and that the treatments must continue. Meanwhile, from the doctor's perspective, this is becoming a real chore. He sees multiple hysterical patients a day, and the manual process of inducing paroxysm convulsions is genuinely exhausting for him. His hands cramp, his wrists ache. It's a tedious, time-consuming part of his practice, and frankly, he's getting tired of it. There has to be a better way. This practical problem, doctor fatigue, is what led to one of history's most ironic inventions. You're about to witness the birth of a device that will have a very long and colorful future, but its origins are strictly, and rather comically, medical. The doctor, a man named Joseph Mortimer Granville, was not just a physician but also an inventor, always tinkering with new gadgets to make his work more efficient. He had been experimenting with electrical devices for pain relief and muscle stimulation. One day, it occurs to him, what if he could create a mechanical device to perform the pelvic massage for him? It would be faster, more consistent, and would save him from getting carpal tunnel syndrome. And so, in the late 1880s, Dr. Granville patents his invention. He calls it the Percut EUR, or more colloquially, the Granville's hammer. It's a cumbersome, hand-held electromechanical device with a buzzing, vibrating head. It is, for all intents and purposes, the world's first electric vibrator. You might picture something sleek and modern, but this first model was a beast. It was heavy, often made of metal and wood, and had to be powered by a bulky, noisy battery. Some early models were even powered by steam or gas. It was sold exclusively as a medical instrument, a respectable piece of therapeutic equipment for physicians. Its marketing materials were incredibly dry and clinical, showing diagrams of its internal mechanics and touting its effectiveness in treating muscle aches, neuralgia, and, of course, hysteria. Your wife's forward-thinking doctor decides to invest in one of these newfangled contraptions. On her next visit, instead of the doctor's hands, She is introduced to the strange, buzzing machine. The procedure is now much faster. The doctor can bring her to paroxysm in a matter of minutes, not an hour. He is delighted. His hands are saved, and he can see more patients in a day. It's a triumph of modern industrial efficiency applied to the female nervous system. For your wife, the experience is even more alienating. The last shred of human, albeit clinical, contact is gone, replaced by the impersonal hum and vibration of a machine. The absurdity of her situation is amplified. Her deepest, most suppressed bodily responses are being summoned by a whirring gadget operated by a detached physician who is probably thinking about what he'll have for lunch. There's a fascinating and rather sad historical tidbit. Here advertisements for these devices began appearing in medical journals and even some women's magazines of the time, but they were never, ever marketed for personal use or pleasure. They were always framed as a tool for a doctor, or sometimes as a home-use device for general nerve toning or relieving headaches. The idea that a woman might use it on herself for her own enjoyment was completely outside the realm of imagination, or at least outside the realm of what could be publicly stated. Historians are still debating the precise moment when the vibrator transitioned from a purely medical device to a tool for personal pleasure. The evidence suggests it was a very slow and secret process. Rachel Maines, a historian who wrote a groundbreaking book on this topic called The Technology of Orgasm, argues that for decades, the device's true purpose was a kind of open secret that no one dared to acknowledge. Doctors knew it worked, but framed it as medicine. Manufacturers sold it as a health aid, and the women who were rated with it were have to process the experience in silence. The invention was a direct result of the Victorian era's complete inability to talk about female sexuality, because they couldn't admit that women had sexual desires that might need fulfilling. They had to invent a disease hysteria and then invent a medical device to cure it. Your wife's treatments are now quicker, more efficient, and more profoundly weird than ever before. The doctor is happy, his practice is booming, but your wife seems more distant than ever. The mechanical cure has done nothing to touch the real source of her unhappiness, the stifling boredom, the lack of purpose, the crushing weight of being an angel in a house that feels more like a prison. The buzzing of the machine in the doctor's office is just another noise that drowns out the silence of a life unlived. Let's leave the quiet, suffocating parlors and the sterile doctor's offices for a moment. I want you to step out into the night. But this isn't the respectable, gas-lit street where you live. We're going somewhere else. We're heading into the heart of London, into the labyrinthine streets of the city's teeming, impoverished East End. The air here is different. It's thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, sheep gin, roasting chestnuts, and the ever-present, acrid haze of coal smoke pouring from a million chimneys. The gentle quiet of your neighborhood is replaced by a chaotic symphony, the rattle of carriage wheels on cobblestones, the distant bellow of a ship's horn from the Thames, the raucous laughter spilling from a pub, and the murmur of 1,000 hushed, hurried conversations. This is the other side of the Victorian coin, the world your angel in the house is so carefully shielded from. As you walk these dimly lit streets, you begin to notice them. At first, you see just one or two, standing in a dark doorway or under the faint glow of a gas lamp. A woman, wearing a dress that is perhaps a bit too colorful, a bonnet tilted at a slightly too jaunty angle. She catches your eye and offers a small, knowing smile. Then you see another, and another. Soon, you realize they are everywhere, on street corners, strolling along the main thoroughfares, gathered in small groups in the narrow alleyways. They are women of all ages, from girls who look barely out of childhood to hardened, middle-aged women with weary eyes. You are witnessing what moral crusaders of the time called the great social evil. This was the euphemism for the staggering scale of prostitution in Victorian London. It wasn't a hidden, fringe activity. It was a massive, highly visible, and deeply entrenched part of city life. How massive, that's a question historians still struggle with. because the records are notoriously unreliable. But contemporary estimates were shocking. One police commissioner guessed there were around 600 prostitutes working in London in the mid-19th century. Other social commentators and journalists, probably with a flair for the dramatic, put the number as high as 80. For context, the entire population of London at the time was around 2.5 million. Whatever the true number, it was an undeniable fact that a veritable army of women, and it was almost exclusively women, sold their bodies every night to survive. Why were there so many? The answer lies in the brutal economics of the Industrial Revolution. Thousands of people were pouring into cities like London from the countryside, looking for work. That for a woman, especially a poor, uneducated one, the options were grim. She could work in a factory for 14 hours a day for wages that could barely keep her from starving. She could become a domestic servant, where she was often at the mercy of her employers, working around the clock for a pittance, or she could go into needlework, a profession romanticized in novels but which, in reality, often led to blindness and poverty. For many, prostitution wasn't a moral failing, it was a rational, if desperate, economic choice. It paid better than the factory. It offered a degree of autonomy that a servant could only dream of. Here's a small, sad detail of their existence. Many of these women were not full-time prostitutes. They were factory workers or seamstresses who, at the end of a grueling workday, would take to the streets to earn enough extra money to pay their rent or buy food. They were part-timers in the sex economy, driven by necessity. This vast, complex world was its own ecosystem, with its own hierarchies, territories, and rules. It operated in plain sight, a constant, uncomfortable reminder of the poverty and hypocrisy that underpinned the era's economic boom. The same wealthy industrialists and respectable gentlemen who insisted on angelic purity in their wives and daughters were the primary clients of this sprawling nocturnal industry. The sight is overwhelming. It's a silent, swirling tide of humanity, the shadow economy operating under the cloak of darkness. You see smartly dressed gentlemen in top hats haggling with women in shawls. You see drunken sailors staggering arm in arm with giggling girls. You see the tired faces, the forced smiles, the quick, transactional exchanges. This isn't the clean, orderly world of bourgeois propriety. This is the messy, desperate, vibrant underbelly. The great social evil wasn't just a moral problem, it was the direct consequence of a society that paid women starvation wages, gave them few legal rights, and then condemned them for choosing the one profession that allowed them a chance at survival. As you stand on that crowded, noisy street corner, you realize the quiet parlor and the chaotic alleyway are not separate worlds. They are two sides of the same system, inextricably linked by a web of money, power, and desire that no one dared to speak of in the daylight. Let's stay here in the gas, lit gloom for a little longer, but I want you to focus on one of the figures in this crowd. Look closer at one of the women standing near the entrance to a gin palace. She can't be more than 20. Her dress is made of cheap, printed cotton, faded from too many washings. She wears a shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, less for modesty and more for warmth against the damp London chill. Her face, under the harsh gaslight, is a mixture of youth and a deep, soul-crushing weariness. This is a common streetwalker, the infantry of the army of the night. She is what the Victorians, in their sentimental but judgmental way, would call a fallen woman or a 堕落天使, a fallen angel. Her life is a relentless grind, governed by a few simple, brutal realities: finding a client, securing a room, and earning enough to survive until the next night. Her patch of pavement is her place of business. The competition is fierce. On a single block, there might be dozens of other women trying to catch the eye of the same potential customers. She has to be bold enough to make eye contact, to offer a suggestive comment, but not so bold as to attract the unwanted attention of the police, who could arrest her for public nuisance or vagrancy. It's a constant, nerve-wracking performance. If she finds a client, The next challenge is finding a place to go. She certainly can't take him back to the crowded, single room she likely shares with 2 or 3 other women. So, they would go to a doss house or a penny sleep, places that rented out rooms or more often, just a bid by the hour. These places were squalid, filthy, and offered no security. She might be robbed by the client or the innkeeper. The transaction itself would be quick, impersonal, and shadowed by the constant threat of violence. Her earnings for one such encounter might be just a few shillings, maybe enough for a hot meal and a bed for the night, if she was lucky. The term fallen woman is interesting because it implies she fell from a great height of purity. But for most of these women, there was no height to fall from. Many were orphans, or had run away from abusive homes, or were simply born into a level of poverty so absolute that this life was almost preordained. Here's a chilling detail that reveals the cycle of poverty. Many streetwalkers were the daughters of other streetwalkers. They were born into the profession, and it was the only life they ever knew. They started young, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, often introduced to the trade by their own mothers or by older women who acted as informal pimps, offering protection and a room in exchange for a large cut of their earnings. The academic world is still trying to piece together the true lived experiences of these women, which is incredibly difficult because they left almost no records of their own. Their story has largely been told by others, by male journalists looking for a sensational story, by male police officers writing reports, and by male social reformers who saw them as pathetic victims to be rescued and reformed. One of the few sources we have that claims to be a first-person account is a controversial book called Walter, The Secret Diary of a Victorian Gentleman who chronicled his encounters with thousands of prostitutes. While it's a valuable, if disturbing, document, historians debate its authenticity and the reliability of its author. It tells us a lot about the man's desires, but how much does it tell us about the real lives and feelings of the women he met? These women were wrapped in a cruel paradox. Society created the economic conditions that forced them into this life, and then it punished them for it. A man who solicited their services could walk away with his reputation intact. He was just sowing his wild oats. That the woman was branded for life. She was a pollutant, a moral contagion. If she tried to leave the life and get a respectable job as a maid or a factory worker, her past would almost inevitably be discovered, and she would be fired and cast out. There were charitable institutions, like the Magdalene Asylums, that offered to rehabilitate fallen women, but the conditions were oft unharshened prison-like, focused on religious indoctrination and hard labor. For many, staying on the streets felt like the freer option. You look at the young woman again. A man in a bowler hat stops to talk to her. They exchange a few words, a quick negotiation in the dark. She nods, pulls her shawl a little tighter. Then they walk off together down a narrow, unlit alley. She doesn't look back. For her, this isn't a story of sin or seduction. It's just business. The grim, repetitive, dangerous business of staying alive in a world that has offered her no other choice. Now, let's turn away from the desperate grit of the street corner and travel west, towards the more fashionable squares of London, like Street, James's or Mayfair. The streets here are wider, cleaner, and the gas lamps burn brighter. Here, amidst the gentlemen's clubs and grand townhouses, another kind of transaction is taking place, but it operates on a completely different level. You might see a beautiful, impeccably dressed woman stepping out of a private carriage. She is not an angel in the house, and she is certainly not a common streetwalker. She is a high-class courtesan, a figure of glamour, scandal, and a strange kind of power. This woman lives in a world apart from the woman in the faded cotton dress. She doesn't shiver on a street corner. She lives in a lavishly furnished apartment in a respectable neighborhood, paid for by a wealthy benefactor. Her wardrobe is filled with the latest fashions from Paris. She has her own servants, her own carriage. She is educated, witty, and can converse intelligently about art, literature, and politics in a society that expected its good women to be silent and demure. The courtesan's sharp-minded and sparkling conversation were a key part of her allure. She offered not just a physical escape for the wealthy Victorian gentleman, but an intellectual one, too. Her clients were not drunken sailors or clerks. They were aristocrats, politicians, industrial tycoons, and sometimes even royalty. The relationship was often a long-term arrangement. A wealthy man would become her patron or protector, providing her with a comfortable lifestyle in exchange for her exclusive companionship. This wasn't a quick, anonymous transaction in a filthy back room. It was a form of parallel marriage, an open secret among the upper echelons of society. The man might have his pure, passionate angel at home to manage his household and produce his heirs, and his charming, sophisticated courtesan in a discreet apartment to provide the excitement, conversation, and intimacy his marriage lacked. One of the most famous courtesans of the era was a woman named Catherine Walters, known as Skittles. She was a brilliant horsewoman, famous for her daring riding style in Hyde Park, where she would draw crowds of admirers. She was beautiful, intelligent, and had a string of incredibly powerful lovers, including members of Parliament and the future King Edward VII. She was a celebrity. Her fashion choices were copied. Her movements were reported in gossip columns. She amassed a fortune and eventually retired to a life of respectable comfort. Women like Skittles occupied a buzz our social space. They were publicly condemned as immoral, yet privately sought after and even celebrated for their beauty and wit. They were outcasts who were simultaneously at the very center of high society's hidden life. Here's a fascinating, niche detail about their world. The kept woman arrangement was so common that it had its own informal real estate market. Certain neighborhoods, like Street, Johnswood, became known as the preferred district for wealthy men to set up their mistresses in comfortable villas. It was far enough from Mayfair to be discreet, but close enough to be convenient. Real estate agents of the time would have understood immediately what a gentleman was looking for if he asked for a pretty, private villa in that part of town. However, historians still debate the true level of autonomy these women had. Were they powerful, independent women who cleverly manipulated the system to their advantage, or were they just better paid, more comfortable versions of the streetwalker, still ultimately dependent on the whims and wealth of men? The answer is likely somewhere in between, unvaried from woman to woman. A successful courtesan had to be a shrewd businesswoman. She had to manage her finances, her reputation, and her relationships with multiple powerful and often married men. One misstep, one scandal that became public could ruin her, and her career was short. Her value was tied to her youth and beauty. Once those began to fade, she could be cast aside with nothing. For every Skittles who retired wealthy, there were countless others who ended their lives in poverty and obscurity when their patrons grew tired of them. So as you watch this glamorous woman step from her carriage, her silk dress rustling, you see another facet of the Victorian paradox. She has achieved a level of freedom and material comfort that her angelic sisters in marriage could only dream of. She can own property in her own name, control her own money, and speak her mind. But this freedom comes at the cost of her reputation and her social standing. She is a queen in a gilded cage, her reign entirely dependent on her ability to charm and please the very men who upheld the system that publicly shunned her. Her life is a high wire act, performed without a safety net, over a chasm of social ruin. So, you're a Victorian gentleman. You have your respectable home, your angel of a wife, and perhaps a burgeoning curiosity about the city's hidden nightlife. But how do you navigate this secret world? You can't exactly ask your friends for recommendations at the club, at least not in plain language. The risk of scandal is too high. How do you find the high-class courtesans, or even just a safe and clean brothel? Without stumbling through the most dangerous parts of town, don't worry. For the discerning gentleman of means, there was, of course, a guidebook. You find yourself in a dusty, dimly lit bookshop that specializes in rare and specialist texts. You make a quiet inquiry to the proprietor, and after a discreet exchange, he retrieves a small, plainly bound book from under the counter. There's no title on the cover. It's anonymous, unassuming. You might mistake it for a book of psalms or a dry academic treatise. You slip it into your coat pocket and wait until you are in the privacy of your study to examine it. You open the book. Its title is something like The Swell's Night Guide or The Man of Pleasure's Companion. It is, essentially, a Yelp review for the Victorian sex trade. These underground publications were surprisingly common, catering to a wealthy, literate clientele of men. The book is a detailed, and often surprisingly witty, directory of the prostitutes, brothels, and accommodating houses of London. It lists women by name or pseudonym, gives their addresses, and provides a short, critical review of their services. The entries are written in a tone that is part connoisseur, part gossip columnist. One entry might praise Miss Eliza for her charming conversation and delicate manners, noting that her apartment is furnished in the most exquisite taste. Another might critique Mademoiselle Dubois, describing her as a fine figure of a woman, though perhaps a bit too fond of the bottle. They would detail physical attributes, special skills, and prices, all in a coded, euphemistic language that was perfectly understandable to the intended audience. A woman might be described as having a lively disposition or a generous nature. The guide might also warn you away from certain establishments, noting that the claret is of a poor vintage, a euphemism for the women being unattractive or diseased, or that the proprietor's is known for her avarice. One of the most famous of these real-life guides was called Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies, which was published annually for several decades in the late 18th century, but its tradition and style carried on into the Victorian era in other forms. Here's a bizarre little tidbit about these books. They were often written with a great deal of literary flair, filled with classical allusions and clever puns. The authors saw themselves as critics and satirists, providing a service to men of taste. They were the Michelin guides of the underworld. The existence of these books tells us so much about the era's hypocrisy. The same society that prosecuted people for publishing obscene literature allowed these guides to circulate, albeit secretly, among the wealthy and powerful. It highlights the stark class divide in how vice was treated. A poor man caught with a cheap, pornographic pamphlet could be arrested. A wealthy gentleman could consult his elegantly written guide to debauchery with impunity. The law, it seemed, was more concerned with the vulgarity of the poor than the sins of the rich. There is, of course, an ongoing debate among historians about the accuracy of these guides. Were the women described real people? Were the reviews based on actual experiences? Or were they partly fictionalized, embellished for entertainment? It's likely a mix of both. Some of the addresses and names were probably real, while the descriptions were likely exaggerated to make for a more titillating read. They are not reliable census data, but they are an incredible window into the mindset of the Victorian male elite. They reveal a world where women were commodified, categorized, and reviewed like fine wines or racehorses. As you flip through the thin, brittle pages of your secret book, you feel like you've been given a key to a hidden city that exists in parallel to the one you know. Every street name you recognize is suddenly imbued with a new, secret meaning. That respectable-looking townhouse on that quiet square, according to your guide, it's one of the most exclusive brothels in the city, run by a Mrs. H who caters only to gentlemen of the highest rank. The book is a map of the city's desires, a testament to the fact that no matter how much you try to suppress human nature with rules and propriety, it will always find a way to create its own systems, its own literature, and its own secret economies. You close the book. The faint, musty smell of old paper filling the air. The city outside your window will never look quite the same again. You've explored the different strata of this hidden world, from the desperate streetwalker to the glamorous courtesan. You've seen how it was organized, catalogued, and navigated, but now we have to talk about the invisible guest at every one of these encounters. It was a silent, terrifying specter that haunted the brothels, the high-class apartments, and even the marital beds of the Victorian era. It was the disease that everyone feared but few understood: syphilis. In an age before antibiotics, syphilis was a devastating and terrifying illness. It was the great, unspoken plague of the 19th century. Its symptoms were horrific, its progression relentless, and its cure non-existent. The disease moved in stages. The primary stage might be just a single, painless sore, easily missed or ignored, but then it would disappear, and the infected person might think they were fine. Weeks or months later, the secondary stage would erupt: a skin rash, fever, sore throat, patchy hair loss. This stage could also fade away, lulling the person into a false sense of security. The real horror was the tertiary stage, which could lie dormant for years, even decades, before re-emerging to attack the body from the inside out. It could cause grotesque tumors, eat away at bone and cartilage, sometimes causing a person's nose to collapse. A telltale sign, and, most terrifyingly, it could attack the brain and nervous system, leading to paralysis, blindness, and a slow, agonizing descent into madness. This final stage was known as general paralysis of the insane. This disease cut across all class lines. While it was rampant in the slums and among prostitutes, it just as easily found its way into the drawing rooms of the wealthy. A gentleman could contract it from a prostitute, remain asymptomatic for years, and then unknowingly pass it on to his pure, angelic wife in their marriage bed. She, in turn, could pass it on to her unborn children. This was known as congenital syphilis, and it was a tragedy. Babies would be born with severe deformities, blindness, deafness, and developmental problems. The disease was a secret, corrupting thread that could unravel an entire family from within. The fear of syphilis was everywhere, and it fueled much of the era's anxiety about sex, but the medical understanding of it was murky at best. Here's a strange and dangerous piece of medical misinformation from the time. For a long while, many doctors believed that gonorrhea and syphilis were just different manifestations of the same single disease. A physician named John Hunter famously tried to prove this in the 1760s by inoculating himself with pus from a gonorrhea patient. Unfortunately, that patient also happened to have syphilis, so Dr. Hunter ended up with both diseases and eventually died from complications. His well-intentioned but disastrous experiment helped solidify this incorrect theory for decades, hampering any real progress in understanding or treating the illnesses separately. The cures were almost as horrific as the disease itself. The most common treatment was mercury. Patients would be given mercury pills, mercury steam baths, or have mercury ointments rubbed into their skin. The idea was to induce profuse salivation and sweating to expel the disease. The side effects were brutal neurological damage, kidney failure, and the loss of teeth and hair. The phrase "a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury" became a grimly popular saying. In many cases, patients died from mercury poisoning long before the syphilis could kill them. It was a desperate, toxic gamble. Historians still argue about the true prevalence of the disease. Because of the social stigma, it was often misdiagnosed or covered up on death certificates. A doctor might write nervous exhaustion or atrophy of the brain to spare a respectable family from shame. But by analyzing skeletal remains from the period and reading between the lines of medical records, some scholars believe that a significant portion of the urban population, perhaps as high as 10–15%, may have been infected at some point in their lives. It was an epidemic hiding in plain sight. The shadow of this disease colored every aspect of Victorian sexuality. It was used by moralists as a divine punishment for sin. It fueled the obsession with wifely purity, as a virgin bride was seen as the only safe option for a man wanting to start a family. It created a deep-seated terror of the fallen woman, who was seen not just as morally corrupt, but as a literal vector of death and insanity. As you stand in the imaginary streets of this Victorian city, you can almost feel the fear in the air. It's the fear of the unseen, the fear of a pleasure that could lead to a slow, ugly death, the fear of a single night's mistake poisoning an entire bloodline. It was the dark secret that lay beneath the surface of every illicit touch and every whispered promise. In the face of this terrifying, invisible threat, and with the immense social and financial pressure to control family size, you would think the Victorians would have been desperate for reliable methods of contraception and protection. And they were. But the landscape of birth control in the 19th century was a confusing and often dangerous minefield of misinformation, folk remedies, and nascent technology. It was a topic shrouded in even more secrecy and shame than sex itself. For the respectable married couple, the very idea of contraception was morally fraught. The primary, and many argued only, legitimate purpose of marital relations was procreation. To interfere with that process was seen by many religious and social authorities as unnatural, even sinful. Doctors, for their part, were often hostile to the idea, with some arguing that preventing pregnancy would lead to moral decay and encourage promiscuity in women. So, if you were that angel in the house, you couldn't just go to a doctor and ask for advice. The topic was taboo. This official wall of silence meant that people had to rely on a patchwork of methods, ranging from the somewhat effective to the utterly useless and even harmful. The most common and oldest method was, of course, coitus interruptus, or the withdrawal method. It required no special equipment and was free, but its reliability depended entirely on the man's self-control, making it a constant source of anxiety. Another method gaining some traction was the rhythm method, based on the idea of avoiding intercourse during a woman's fertile period. The problem was, medical understanding of the female reproductive cycle was completely wrong for most of the century. It was widely believed that women were most fertile right after their period, not in the middle of their cycle. So many couples who were diligently practicing the rhythm method were, in fact, doing the exact opposite of what they should have been doing. For those willing to seek out more tangible solutions, there was a burgeoning, unregulated market for contraceptive devices. The condom, made from animal intestine known as a skin or, later, vulcanized rubber, did exist, but it was not what you imagine today. Early rubber condoms were thick, uncomfortable, and had to be washed and reused. They were often marketed not as contraceptives, but as a prophylactic measure for men visiting prostitutes to prevent disease. A respectable man would be unlikely to use one with his wife, as it would imply that he was either unfaithful or that their marital relations were no different from a commercial transaction. For women, the options were even more grim. The cervical cap and diaphragm were invented during this period, but they were often ill-fitting and difficult to use correctly without proper medical guidance, which was rarely available. This led women to resort to more desperate measures. One of the most common methods was douching after intercourse with a variety of spermicide solutions. Here's a rather alarming tidbit. Popular douching solutions included things like alum, carbolic acid, or even mercuric chloride. These were harsh, caustic chemicals that could cause severe internal burns, inflammation, and long-term damage, all in the name of female hygiene. Women were, quite literally, poisoning themselves in an attempt to control their fertility. The historical debate around this topic often centers on the birth control underground, while mainstream society was silent or hostile. A small but dedicated group of social reformers and free thinkers began to publish and distribute information about contraception. These were radical, dangerous texts. People were prosecuted, and jailed for publishing pamphlets that provided explicit information on how to prevent pregnancy. These activists argued that access to birth control was a fundamental human right, essential for women's health and for alleviating poverty. They were the pioneers of the family planning movement, but in the Victorian era, they were treated as criminals and purveyors of filth. So, imagine you're back in that marriage bed. The duty has been performed. And now, a quiet panic sets in. Another baby would stretch the family finances to the breaking point. Another pregnancy could be dangerous for your wife's already fragile health. What do you do? Do you rely on hope? Do you resort to a whispered, back alley purchase of a questionable rubber device? Or does your wife, in the privacy of her dressing room, use a syringe filled with a stinging, toxic solution, praying that it works? This was the reality for millions. The lack of safe, reliable contraception created a constant, low-level hum of anxiety that underscored the most intimate moments of their lives. It was another layer of fear and uncertainty in an era that was already defined by it. Let's return to the quiet sanctuary of the gentleman's private study. The fire is crackling in the hearth. The door is locked, and the heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the outside world. This is a space of male solitude, a refuge from the demands of both the public world and the domestic sphere. And it's in spaces like this, hidden from the view of wives, children, and servants, that another thriving, secret industry found its audience. You've already seen the guidebooks to the city's nightlife, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. We're about to open a plain brown paper package that has just been delivered by a discreet messenger. Inside, you find a book. It's a novel, but not the kind of 3-volume family saga by Dickens or Thackeray that sits on the parlor table. This one is cheaply printed, with no publisher's name on the title page. The title is something lurid and suggestive. Perhaps The Lustful Turk or The Sins of the Cities of the Plain. You have just acquired a piece of Victorian pornography. In an age where public expression was so incredibly restricted, the private world of illicit literature flourished, while the mainstream novel was becoming more and more focused on morality and domestic life. A parallel universe of erotic fiction was being secretly written, printed, and distributed. These books were the complete opposite of everything the angel in the house stood for. They were filled with explicit, detailed descriptions of every imaginable sexual act, shattering every social and religious taboo. The characters were often governesses, clergymen, and innocent young ladies who discovered a world of unrestrained passion. The stories frequently involved themes of defloration, flagellation, and orgies, all described in breathless, over-the-top prose. This literature was produced by a hidden network of clandestine printers and booksellers, mostly centered in London and Paris. They operated in constant fear of the authorities. The Society for the Suppression of Vice, a powerful moral watchdog group, was always on the hunt for these obscene publications. If a printer was caught, they faced hefty fines and prison sentences. This constant risk is why the books themselves were so shoddy. They were printed quickly and cheaply, on poor quality paper, designed to be easily hidden or destroyed if necessary. Here's a peculiar detail about this underground world. Many of the most famous and prolific works of Victorian erotica were published anonymously or under pseudonyms, and their true authorship remains a subject of intense academic speculation. For a long time, it was assumed they were all written by raffish, bohemian men. However, some scholars now argue that it's possible women were also involved in writing and even producing these texts. Could some of these wild, transgressive fantasies have been penned by women who were using the anonymity of the genre to explore desires they could never express in real life? It's a tantalizing but difficult question to prove. The trail of evidence often leads to a man named William Lazenby, a shadowy figure who ran a pornographic press in London, but even his operation is shrouded in mystery. Alongside the novels, there was a booming trade in erotic images. The invention of photography in the 1830s was a game changer for the pornography industry. Suddenly, You could have a realistic, graphic image instead of an engraving or drawing. Early erotic photographs, known as daguerreotypes, were produced one at a time and were very expensive, making them a luxury item for the wealthy elite. The models were likely prostitutes or actresses, posed in studios made to look like boudoiresses. They were often stiff and formal, a strange combination of clinical nudity and Victorian formality. As photographic technology improved and became cheaper, these images became more widely available, sold in sets from under the counter of those same discreet bookshops. The existence of this vast, hidden library of lust exposes the profound hypocrisy at the heart of the Victorian gentleman. This was the same man who would clutch his pearls if a novelist used the word trousers instead of incapes. He was the same man who demanded absolute purity from his wife and daughters, and who publicly supported moral reform societies. But in the privacy of his study, he was a voracious consumer of the very material he claimed to find so shocking. It was a classic case of the double standard. Morality was for public consumption, and for women, a man's private recreation was considered a separate matter, a necessary outlet for the natural urges that his angelic wife could not, and should not, be expected to satisfy. As you sit in your chair, turning the pages of this forbidden book, the contrast is dizzying. The world outside this room is one of piety and propriety, but the world inside this book is one of pure, unrestrained dead. It's a testament to the fact that you can try to legislate desire, you can try to shame it into silence, but you can't make it go away. It will always find a crack in the facade, a secret room, a plain brown wrapper, to thrive in the dark. The locked study, with its forbidden books and images, was a private theater for the imagination. But as the 19th century wore on, technology offered a new and even more titillating form of secret entertainment. The world was captivated by the new marvel of moving pictures. The flickering, silent images of a train arriving at a station or workers leaving a factory seemed like magic, and it didn't take long for entrepreneurial, and less than scrupulous, minds to realize that this new magic could be used to bring those static, erotic photographs to life. You find yourself in a different kind of venue now. It's not a grand music hall or a public cinema. It's a smoky, private backroom, perhaps in a pub or the secluded men's club. A small group of gentlemen has gathered. A white sheet is tacked to one wall. In the center of the room is a hand-cranked projector, a clunky, noisy contraption of brass and wood. The operator dims the gas lights, and with a rhythmic clatter, the show begins. On the screen, a grainy, flickering image appears. It's a woman, in a boudoir setting, similar to the erotic photographs. But then, she moves. She slowly, deliberately begins to remove her clothing. A stocking is peeled off, a corset is unlaced. The movements are slow, almost theatrical, dictated by the short running time of the film reel. The film might only be a minute or two long, but for the audience, it was revolutionary. This was the birth of the stag film, the direct ancestor of the modern pornographic movie. These early films were incredibly tame by today's standards. Of course, they rarely showed more than nudity, and the quality was poor, but their power lay in their novelty. The act of watching a private moment, a secret act of undressing, unfold in real time was a potent thrill. The films had titles that were cheeky and suggestive, like The Bride's First Night or What the Butler Saw. This latter title became a whole genre, based on the popular peep show machines found in seaside arcades. The premise was always the same: a keyhole or a crack in a door gives the viewer a stolen glimpse of a woman in a state of undress. It played directly into the Victorian obsession with voyeurism, the pleasure of looking at something you're not supposed to see. Here's a specific, and rather famous, example. An early French film from 1896 by director Eugene Piroyou, titled The Cowker d'Almery, The Bedtime of the Bride. is often cited by film historians as one of the very first narrative erotic films. It featured an actress performing a striptease for her unseen husband, the camera. It caused a scandal, was a huge commercial success, and was immediately copied by filmmakers in other countries. The debate among film scholars, however, is about how widely these films were actually seen. Were they a common feature of this male-only underworld, or were they a rare novelty, with only a few prints circulating among the very wealthy? The ephemeral nature of early film stock makes it hard to know for sure. Many of these films are lost forever, and we only know of them through written descriptions or police reports. The production of these films was a risky, fly-by-night operation. They were often filmed in secret, makeshift studios, using actresses or prostitutes as performers. The filmmakers were a motley crew of inventors, photographers, and showmen who saw a quick way to make a profit from this new technology. They were constantly on the run from the same vice societies that hunted down pornographic printers. The films themselves had to be distributed through a clandestine network, passed from hand to hand or shown at these private smoker events for a select, all-male audience. The emergence of the stag film highlights the intersection of technology, commerce, and desire. Every time a new medium is invented, from the printing press to the internet, one of its very first applications is pornography. The Victorians, for all their public prudery, were no exception. They were fascinated by technology, the steam engine, the telegraph, the photograph, and they were just as fascinated by sex. It was almost inevitable that the two would meet. The projector clatters to a halt. The image on the screen vanishes, replaced by a blank white square. The gas lights are turned back up. The men in the room blink, adjusting to the light, a few of them chuckling or making quiet comments. The magic is over. They have witnessed a marvel of the modern age, a moving picture that showed them something forbidden. It was another secret to be kept, another experience that widened the already vast gulf between their public lives as respectable citizens and their private lives as men of pleasure. The shared secret in that smoky backroom was a bond, reinforcing their membership in an exclusive club, one that operated by a completely different set of rules than the world outside. Let's move away from the world of commercial, transcational sex and into an even more deeply hidden, more profoundly taboo territory for the Victorians. All the activities we've discussed so far, the affairs with courtesans, the visits to brothels, the consumption of pornography, were considered sins, vices, or moral failings, that they were, at least, acknowledged to exist. There was, however, a form of love and desire that society refused to even name. All of that, in the eyes of the law and the church, was not just a sin, but an abomination, a crime against nature. We're talking about same-sex love. You are now in a different kind of private space. Perhaps it's a cozy, book-lined flat shared by two women who are known to their social circle as inseparable companions or devoted spinsters. Or perhaps you are at a discreet gathering in the elegant apartment of a wealthy bachelor, an aesthete who surrounds himself with beautiful art and a circle of like-minded young men. On the surface, nothing is out of place, but if you listen closely to the conversations, if you watch the subtle gestures, the lingering glances, you might sense a current of intimacy that runs deeper than mere friendship. For most of the Victorian era, the concept of a homosexual identity as we understand it today did not exist. There was no shared vocabulary, no sense of a common community. There were only acts. For men, the situation was clear and dangerous. The Buggery Act of 1533, which was still on the books, made any sexual act between two men a crime punishable by death until 1861, and by life imprisonment after that. In 1885, things got even worse with the infamous law Boucher, the amendment. This new law made any act of gross indecency between men a crime, even if it occurred in private. The law was notoriously vague about what gross indecency actually meant. which made it a powerful tool for blackmail and persecution. It meant that a love letter, a shared bed, or even an affectionate embrace could be used as evidence to send a man to prison with hard labor. This severe legal threat forced gay men to live a life of extreme caution and secrecy. They developed their own coded language and subtle signals to recognize one another. They created hidden social networks, meeting in specific pubs, bathhouses, or certain sections of public parks. This is where a small, strange detail emerges: the world of male prostitution, which catered to both heterosexual and homosexual clients, was one of the few places where these worlds could openly, if transactionally, intersect. Young working-class men, often soldiers or telegraph messengers, would offer their services to a wealthy gentleman. These encounters were fraught with danger for both parties, a mix of genuine desire, economic necessity, and the constant risk of exposure, arrest, or blackmail. For women, the situation was entirely different, and in some ways, more complex. Lesbianism was, quite simply, invisible. It was not illegal. In fact, it was so far outside the realm of Victorian comprehension that the law didn't even acknowledge its existence. There's a famous, though likely apocryphal, story that when the Labouche Amendment was being drafted, Queen Victoria herself struck out a clause that would have criminalized sex between women, because she simply refused to believe that any woman would do such a thing. Whether the story is true or not, it reflects the prevailing attitude. Female sexuality was already denied. The idea of a woman desiring another woman was just a step too far into the absurd. This legal invisibility gave women a freedom that men did not have. Two women could live together, share a home, and build a life partnership without raising the same level of suspicion as two men. These relationships were often called Boston marriages, and they were socially acceptable because they were assumed to be entirely platonic and non-sexual. They were seen as a practical arrangement for educated, unmarried women who wanted companionship. But how many of these relationships were truly platonic? Historians passionately debate this. By reading the passionate, emotional, and sometimes surprisingly physical language in the letters and diaries between these women, many scholars are convinced that these were often deeply romantic and erotic partnerships. They were love stories hidden in plain sight, protected by a society that couldn't even imagine their true nature. So, in this world, love between two people of the same sex was forced into two different closets. For men, it was a dark, legally perilous closet, where every action was shadowed by the fear of the policeman's knock. For women, it was a closet of invisibility, a love so thoroughly dismissed and disbelieved that it was, in a strange way, left alone. In both cases, individuals had to navigate a world that offered them no reflection of themselves, no language for their feelings, and no path to an open and honest life. They had to create their own small, secret worlds, built on trust, discretion, and the quiet, revolutionary act of loving someone against the grain of an entire civilization. The secret world of same-sex love, particularly among men, was a precarious one, always just one mistake, one betrayal, away from ruin. For decades, it remained in the shadows, a subject of whispered gossip and blackmail threats. But in 1895, a sensational series of trials would drag this hidden world violently into the public spotlight. This was the moment the unspoken became front-page news. You are now a spectator in the crowded, stuffy courtroom of the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court. The air is thick with anticipation and righteous indignation. In the dock stands one of the most famous men of his time, the brilliant, flamboyant, and witty playwright, Oscar Wilde. Wilde was at the absolute peak of his fame. His play, The Importance of Being Earnest, was the toast of the London stage. He was a celebrity, known for his dazzling wit, his aesthetic philosophy of art for art's sake, and his carefully crafted public persona. He was married, had 2 children, and lived a seemingly respectable, if eccentric, life, but behind this facade, Wilde was the center of a vibrant, hidden homosexual subculture. His great love, and his eventual downfall, was a handsome young aristocrat named Lord Alfred Douglas, known to his friends as Boss IE. The whole tragic affair began not with Wilde, but with Boss IE's father, the Marquis of Queensberry. Queensberry was a notoriously brutish and belligerent man who was enraged by his son's relationship with Wilde. He began a campaign of public harassment against the playwright. The final straw came when Queensberry left his calling card at Wilde's club with a deliberately misspelled, accusatory message scrawled on it for Oscar Wilde, posing Psalm du mighty mens adomet. Urged on by Boss IE, who hated his father, Wilde made a catastrophic decision. He decided to sue the Marquis for criminal libel. It was an act of incredible hubris. To win the case, Wilde would have to prove that he was not, in fact, what Queensberry accused him of being. And so the first trial began. You watch as Queensberry's lawyers systematically dismantle Wilde's case. They weren't just defending their client, they were putting Wilde's entire life on trial. They produced a parade of witnesses, young, working-class men, prostitutes, bookmakers, grooms who were tracked down by private investigators. One by one, they took the stand and described their encounters with Wilde in private hotel rooms, unrented apartments. They spoke of evenings filled with champagne, expensive dinners, and gifts of silver cigarette cases. And they spoke of gross indecency. Wilde's brilliant wit, which had served him so well in the drawing rooms of London, was no match for this brutal, detailed testimony. The libel case collapsed. Wilde withdrew the charges, but it was too late. The evidence unearthed during the libel trial was handed over to the Director of Public Prosecutions. A warrant was issued for Wilde's arrest under the Labouche Amendment. Now, he was the one in the dock. The second and third trials were a public spectacle. The newspapers, which had once celebrated Wilde, now feasted on the salacious details of the case, printing sensational headlines and moralizing editorials. The courtroom was packed every day with people eager to witness the downfall of a great man. They quirky and rather sad detail from the proceedings. One of the key pieces of evidence used against him was his own art. The prosecutor read passages from his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and his poems, twisting their aesthetic and homoerotic themes into proof of his depraved character. His art was used to condemn him. The central question historians still grapple with is why Wilde didn't flee. His friends urged him to escape to France before he was arrested, but he refused. Was it arrogance, a misguided belief that his genius would protect him? Or was it a kind of fatalistic martyrdom? A decision to face the consequences of his life head on we can never know for sure. He stayed, and he was found guilty of gross indecency. The judge, in his sentencing, called it the worst case I have ever tried, and sentenced him to 2 years in prison with hard labor. The verdict sent a shockwave through Britain's hidden gay community. It was a brutal, public confirmation of their worst fears. Many of Wilde's friends and associates fled the country, fearing they would be next. The trials created a powerful and terrifying stereotype of the homosexual male in the public imagination: decadent, corrupting, and predatory. The name Oscar Wilde became a cautionary tale, a symbol of sin and perversion. You watch as Wilde, a broken man, is led from the dock. The crowd outside cheers. The trial was more than the conviction of one man. It was the public crucifixion of an idea. It drove a vibrant subculture deeper underground and reinforced the walls of the closet with fear and shame for generations to come. The trial of Oscar Wilde was a dramatic, public display of judging a man's character. But in the 19th century, there were other, quieter, and arguably more insidious ways of judging people. The Victorians were obsessed with classification, with creating order out of the chaotic, rapidly changing world around them. They categorized plants, animals, and insects with scientific rigor. and they tried to apply the same scientific rigor to human beings. This led to the rise of a host of popular, but deeply flawed disciplines that we now call pseudoscience. These sciences were used to justify and reinforce the era's rigid social hierarchies of class, race, and, of course, gender. Let's go back to that doctor's office. On his desk, next to the medical journals, you see a strange object, a white, ceramic model of a human head, sectioned off by black lines into dozens of small, labeled regions. This is a phrenology bust. Phrenology was one of the most popular pseudosciences of the Victorian era. This theory, developed by a German physician named Franz Joseph Gall, was that the brain is composed of different organs, each responsible for a specific personality trait: amativeness, love, philoprogenitive, parental love, acquisitiveness, desire for property, and so on. Phrenologists believed that the size of each organ determined the strength of that trait, and that you could measure this by feeling the bumps and indentations on a person's skull. So a man with a prominent bump in the combativeness region would be naturally aggressive. A woman with a large philoprogenitiveness area was destined to be a wonderful, caring mother. You could go to a professional phrenolog, IST, for a reading. They would run their fingers over your scalp and give you a detailed analysis of your character, your strengths, your weaknesses, and even your ideal career path. It was like a horoscope, but with the authority of science. Of course, it was all nonsense. The brain doesn't work that way. But the Victorians loved it, and it was often used to prove the existing social order was natural and correct. For example, phrenological charts often showed that the domestic and moral organs were naturally larger in women, while the intellectual and ambitious organs were larger in men. For scientific proof that a woman's place was in the home, and a man's place was in the world of commerce and ideas. It wasn't a matter of social conditioning, it was a matter of cranial geography. Here's a specific, strange application of the theory. Some employers would ask for a phrenological reading before hiring someone. They wanted to make sure the candidate had a well-developed conscience bump. Some people even chose their marriage partners based on a phrenological assessment of their compatibility. The historical debate here isn't about whether phrenology was real, it wasn't, but about how seriously it was taken. Was it a harmless parlor game for most people? Or did it have a genuine and damaging impact on people's lives and opportunities? The evidence suggests it was somewhere in between, but it absolutely provided a convenient, scientific-sounding justification for all sorts of prejudices. Phrenology was just one of many such sciences. There was also physiognomies, the art of judging character from facial features. A person with a high forehead was intelligent. Shifty eyes meant they weren't trustworthy. They reeked and indicated a lack of moral fiber. Criminologists like Cesare Lombroso developed theories of the criminal type, arguing that criminals were an evolutionary throwback who could be identified by certain physical traits, like a sloping forehead or large ears. These ideas were used to profile and condemn people based on nothing more than their appearance. All these pseudosciences, when applied to sex and gender, did the same thing. They presented the rigid, socially constructed roles of the Victorian era as immutable biological facts. The ideal of the passionals, domestic angel in the house, wasn't just a cultural preference, it was supposedly written into the very shape of her skull. The ideal of the dominant, intellectual male wasn't just a social norm, it was a product of his superior brain structure. These theories provided a comforting sense of certainty in a confusing world. They made prejudice look like logic. They dressed up bigotry in a lab coat. This scientific gaze stripped people of their individuality and reduced them to a collection of predetermined traits. It was another way of controlling and managing human nature, all fitting messy, complex individuals into neat little boxes. As you look at that ceramic head on the doctor's desk, with its confident, precise labels, you see a perfect symbol of the Victorian desire for order. It's a map of a world where everyone has their proper place, and where the bumps on your head are your destiny. A world where who you are, and who you're allowed to love, isn't a matter of the heart, but a matter of bumps. Let's linger for a moment on this idea of the body as a scientific object, something to be managed and controlled. This obsession didn't just apply to the bumps on your head or the supposed congestion in your womb. It extended to the most basic, everyday aspects of life, including hygiene. And here, you'll find that the Victorian relationship with cleanliness, and particularly with bathing, was surprisingly complicated and often contradictory. You might imagine the era as one of pristine, starched color cleanliness, but the reality for most people was, well, a bit grimy. Step into the bedroom of a typical middle-class home. It's morning. You see a person standing over a washed sand. This washed sand is the centerpiece of their daily hygiene routine. It consists of a large ceramic bowl and a matching pitcher filled with cold water. The morning bath involved pouring a small amount of this water into the bowl and using a cloth to wash one's face, hands, and perhaps the underarms. A full body immersion in water was not a daily, or even weekly, event for many people. It was a major undertaking. Why the reluctance to bathe for one thing? It was a huge logistical hassle. There was no indoor plumbing with running hot water in most homes. If you wanted a hot bath, servants had to haul buckets of water, heated over the kitchen fire, up several flights of stairs to fill a portable tin bathtub that was placed in front of the bedroom fireplace. It was a time-consuming, labor-intensive process for the working class, who lived in crowded tenements with no access to private water sources. A full bath was an almost unimaginable luxury. But the aversion to bathing wasn't just practical, it was also medical. Many doctors of the period were deeply suspicious of full-body bathing, especially in hot water. They believed that hot water could be debilitating, that it opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to catching a chill or, worse, contracting diseases by allowing miasma as bad airs to enter the body. Here's a strange, but common piece of advice from the time after a hot bath. One was supposed to immediately get into a pre-warmed bed and avoid going outside for several hours, sometimes until the next day, to prevent illness. Some even believed that too much bathing could strip the skin of its natural, protective oils, leading to nervous disorders or even insanity. This fear of water created some rather interesting habits. People would go to great lengths to clean themselves without getting fully wet. For women, in particular, the focus was on managing odors. They used perfumed powders, sackets of dried herbs tucked into their clothing, and liberal splashes of eau de cologne. The air around a respectable lady would have been a complex bouquet of lavender, rose water, and the faint, underlying scent of an unwashed body. For men and women, clothing itself was a form of hygiene. Undergarments, made of linen or cotton, were changed regularly and were meant to absorb the body's sweat and oils, protecting the more expensive, harder to clean outer layers of wool and silk. Clean linens were a sign of respectability, even if the body underneath wasn't. There is, however, an ongoing historical conversation about a gradual shift in attitudes towards cleanliness that occurred during Victoria's reign. This is sometimes called the sanitary revolution. As cities became more crowded and epidemics like cholera swept through the population, reformers and public health officials began to connect filth with disease. The Great Stink of 1858 in London, when the River Thames became so polluted with raw sewage that the smell was unbearable, famously spurred the government to invest in a modern sewer system. Slowly, the idea that cleanliness is next to guidelines began to take hold. Public bathhouses were built for the poor, and having a dedicated bathroom with a plumbed-in tub became a status symbol for the wealthy by the end of the century. But the transition was slow and uneven. For much of the era, the prevailing view of the body was that it was something slightly disgusting, a source of unpleasant odors and potentially dangerous fluids that needed to be managed, covered, and perfumed into submission. The body was not something to be celebrated or enjoyed in its natural state. This deep-seated bodily shame is the same impulse that led to covering piano legs, using euphemisms for chicken parts, and pathologizing sexual pleasure. It's all part of the same story, a profound cultural discomfort with the messy, physical reality of being human. So as you watch that Victorian individual daintily splashing their face with cold water from a pitcher, you're not just seeing a lack of modern plumbing. You're seeing a whole worldview in action, a worldview that sought to keep the unruly, unpredictable, and slightly dirty human body at a very safe distance. We've spent a lot of time in the shadows, exploring the hypocrisy and the harsh realities imposed upon women, but it would be a mistake to see Victorian women as only passive victims. Throughout the era, there were women who pushed back, who fought against the systems that constrained them. And one of the most powerful and fascinating examples of this was the crusade against a series of laws known as the Contagious Diseases Acts. You are now standing in the audience of a crowded, noisy public hall. The air is charged with righteous anger. On the stage is a woman who, by all accounts, should not be there. She is a respectable, middle-class, educated wife and mother, and she is speaking, forcefully and publicly, about a topic that would make most people blush: syphilis and the state's ancient violation of women's bodies. Her name is Josephine Butler. The Contagious Diseases Acts, first passed in the 1862, were the government's attempt to deal with the rampant spread of venereal disease, particularly syphilis, in the Army and Navy. The logic behind the laws was brutally simple and deeply misogynistic. The government reasoned that soldiers and sailors would always visit prostitutes. That was a given. The problem, therefore, was not the men's behavior, but the health of the women they visited. The acts gave the police in certain important garrison towns the power to arrest any woman they merely suspected of being a prostitute. Once arrested, the woman was forced to undergo a compulsory medical examination. This was an invasive, often brutal, and deeply humiliating internal exam with a speculum, performed by a male military doctor. If she was found to be diseased, she was locked away in a so-called block hospital until she was cured, at which point she was released, and the cycle would often begin again. The laws applied only to women. The imam, the client, could be riddled with disease, that he was free to go on his way, spreading it further, with no consequences. The entire burden of public health was placed on the bodies of the poorest, most vulnerable women in society. This is where Josephine Butler comes in. She was an unlikely revolutionary. A devout Christian and the wife of a clergyman, she was moved by what she saw as the profound injustice of the acts. She believed they were a gross violation of women's civil liberties and a disgusting display of the sexual double standard. In an age when respectable women were not supposed to have a public voice, let alone speak about sexual matters, Butler took to the stage. She founded and led a dynamic, nationwide campaign called the Ladies' National Association for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts. Her actions were shocking to Victorian society. She traveled the country, giving fiery speeches to packed halls. She and her fellow campaigners were heckled, insulted, and sometimes physically assaulted. The opponents called her unfeminine, shameless, a disgrace to her sex. They accused her of wanting to protect sinful women and spread disease. Here's a small but telling detail of her campaign. She deliberately used shocking language. She publicly described the forced examinations as instrumental rape, a phrase that was designed to jolt her middle-class audience out of their complacency. She was a master of political theater. The debate among historians about Butler's campaign is fascinating. Some see her as a proto-feminist hero, a brilliant political organizer who successfully mobilized thousands of women and men to fight for social justice. She skillfully built a coalition that included everyone from pious Quakers to radical working-class men. Others, however, point out the complexities of her position. Butler was still a woman of her time. She was a social purity feminist who believed in moral reform and saw prostitutes primarily as fallen victims to be saved, not necessarily as women with their own agency. Her goal was not sexual liberation in the modern sense, but the protection of women from male vice and state tyranny. The question is, does this make her campaign less significant? Most historians would argue no. In the context of her time, her work was radical and transformative. For over 15 years, Butler and her association campaigned relentlessly. They published pamphlets, organized petitions, and lobbied members of parliament. They exposed the brutal realities of the system, how the police used the laws to harass and blackmail any poor woman. Not just prostitutes, how innocent women were sometimes mistaken and forced to endure the horrific examination. They successfully turned a sanitary issue into a major political battle over the rights of the citizen against the power of the state. And in 1896, they won. The Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed. It was a stunning victory, one of the first major, successful, female-led political campaigns in British history. As you stand in that hall, listening to Josephine Butler's passionate voice ring out, you feel a shift in the air. You are witnessing the birth of a new kind of female power. She and her supporters were not angels in the house. They were lions in the public square. They took the most taboo subjects, sex, disease, and the double standard, and dragged them into the light, forcing a national conversation. Their victory was a crucial step on the long road toward women's suffrage and a more just society. It was a powerful reminder that even in the most repressive of times, there are always those who will refuse to be silent. The fight against the Contagious Diseases Acts was a political earthquake, but tremors of change were being felt in other parts of Victorian society as well. As the century drew to a close, a new figure began to emerge in novels, plays, and the popular press, a figure who both fascinated and frightened the traditionalists. She was called the New Woman, and you see her now, not in a parlor or a courtroom, but gliding down a country lane on a strange, two-wheeled contraption, a bicycle. The bicycle, especially the safety bicycle with its two equally sized wheels that became popular in the 1892, was more than just a new form of transportation. It was a vehicle of liberation. For the first time, a woman had a means of traveling on her own, without a chaperone, without needing a horse and carriage. It gave her an unprecedented freedom of movement. She could cycle out of the city and into the countryside, explore new places, and meet new people, all under her own power. The simple act of riding a bicycle was a radical statement of independence, and it necessitated a radical change in fashion. You can ride a bicycle wearing a tightly laced corset, a heavy bustle, and multiple layers of petticoats. The New Woman shed these restrictive garments in favor of more practical, rational dress. She wore shorter skirts, or most shockingly of all, bloomers, puffy, trouser-like garments that allowed for free movement of the legs. The sight of a woman in bloomers, her ankles brazenly exposed, was enough to cause a moral panic. Conservative critics wailed that the bicycle was an immoral machine, that it would destroy female modesty and lead to all sorts of social ills. There was even a strange medical debate, with some doctors claiming that the posture of sitting on a bicycle saddle was unladylike and could be dangerously stimulating for a woman. But the New Woman was not just about bicycles and bloomers. She was a symbol of a broader shift in attitudes about women's roles in society. She was educated. The late Victorian era saw the founding of the first women's colleges at universities, like Cambridge and Oxford. The New Woman was not content with the limited, decorative education of the angel in the house. She wanted to study science, literature, and history. She wanted a career. She was becoming a teacher, a nurse, a journalist, a typewriter, a new profession for women in offices, and even a doctor. She was often politically engaged, a supporter of women's suffrage and social reform. She also had a different attitude towards marriage. The New Woman did not see marriage as the only possible goal for her life. She might choose to marry later, or not at all. She believed in the idea of a companion-aid marriage, a partnership between equals, rather than the old model of male dominance and female submission. This is a point of interesting historical discussion. Was the new woman a widespread reality, or was she more of a media creation? A figure of fascination and fear for a society grappling with change? The truth is, she was both. The actual number of women who fully embodied the new woman ideal, cycling, college-educated, career-oriented, and politically active, was relatively small. But her image, her idea, was incredibly powerful. She represented a future that was thrilling to some and terrifying to others. She often smoked cigarettes in public, another shocking habit for a woman. She read controversial new woman novels by authors like George Gissing or Sarah Grand, which explored themes of female frustration, unhappy marriages, and the desire for personal and sexual freedom. A funny little cultural detail from the time is the latchkey, which became a symbol of the new woman. The ability to have her own key to her own flat, to come and go as she pleased without needing a husband or a father to let her in, was a potent symbol of her independence. The new woman was, in many ways, the Victorian era's midlife crisis. She was the manifestation of all the anxieties and all the hopes that had been bubbling under the surface for decades. She was the logical extension of Josephine Butler's activism, the intellectual heir to the women who had secretly penned erotic fiction, and the living antithesis of the angel in the house. She was a rejection of the idea that women were inherently passive, passional, and domestic. She was demanding her own life, her own experiences, and her own identity. As you watch her cycle past, her face flushed with exertion and enjoyment, a confident smile on her lips, you see the cracks in the old Victorian facade widening. She is cycling away from the stuffy parlor, away from the doctor's office, away from the expectation that she should be decorative and silent. She is pedaling, with determined energy, towards the 20th century. The world of separate spheres, of rigid gender roles, of unquestioned male authority, was beginning to crumble. And the new woman, with her bicycle and her bloomers, was leading the charge. We've seen the loud revolutions, the protests, the trials, the bicycles, but the Victorian era was also a master of the quiet, subtle rebellion. In a world where direct and honest communication, especially about feelings, was so often discouraged, people became experts in speaking without words, and no silent language was more complex, more nuanced, or more popular than the language of flowers. You are now in a magnificent conservatory, a grand glass and iron structure filled with exotic plants from around the empire. The air is warm, humid, and intoxicatingly fragrant. A young couple is strolling through the ferns and orchids. They are, of course, accompanied by a chaperone. They can't speak freely, but they are having a very detailed conversation. The young man offers the young lady a small, carefully chosen bouquet, a tussie masai or nosegay. It seems like a simple, polite gesture, but it's not. It's a coded message. Every single flower, every leaf, every color has a specific, widely understood meaning. This intricate system was called florography, and the Victorians were obsessed with it. Dozens of flower dictionaries were published, listing the symbolic meaning of hundreds of plants. Let's decode the bouquet he just handed her. He has included a red camellia. That means you are a flame in my heart. Tucked next to it is a sprig of lavender, which signifies devotion and loyalty. But he's also added the yellow hyacinth, which carries a message of jealousy. And hidden at the back is a stalk of basil, which, surprisingly, meant hatred. So, his silent message is a complex emotional cocktail. My heart burns for you with devotion, but I am jealous, and I hate something. Perhaps he hates the rival suitor who was speaking to her earlier. Now, it's her turn to reply. She accepts the bouquet. How she accepts it is the first part of her answer. If she takes it with her right hand, it's a yes or an encouragement. If she uses her left hand, it's a no. Let's say she takes it with her right hand. Then, later, she might appear with a single flower pinned to her dress. If she pins a pink carnation over her heart, She is saying I will never forget you. If she returns a bouquet that includes sweet pea, she is saying thank you for a lovely time. But if she sends back a yellow carnation, she is communicating disdain or rejection. They could have an entire argument, a declaration of love, or a delicate negotiation, all through the exchange of petals and leaves, right under the nose of the oblivious chaperone. This floral code wasn't just for young lovers. It was used for all sorts of social communication. You could send a bouquet of fennel to someone to flatter them worthy of all praise. You could send hydrangeas to accuse someone of being heartless. You are cold. Here's a quirky little detail: the way a flower was presented also changed its meaning. A flower handed over upright meant the positive version of its definition. Handed over upside down, it meant the opposite. So, a red rose, the classic symbol of love, given upside down could mean my love for you is over. It was a system of almost infinite subtlety. Why did this silent language become so popular? Historians still ponder the full cultural significance of the florography craze. On one level, it was simply a charming parlor game, a reflection of the Victorian love for sentimentality, symbolism, and nature. It was a romantic and aesthetically pleasing pastime. But on a deeper level, it was a direct response to the era's emotional repression. In a society that gave people so few tools to express their true feelings, especially the dangerous feelings of love and desire, florography provided a vital, secret outlet. It was a socially acceptable loophole. You couldn't say I burn with passion for you, but you could say it with a red tulip. You couldn't say I'm angry with you, but you could say it with petunias. Your presence soothes me not. Of course, the system wasn't foolproof. Different flower dictionaries sometimes had conflicting definitions, which could lead to disastrous misinterpretations. Imagine thinking you're declaring your undying love, but you've accidentally used a flower that means my condolences on your recent bereavement. The potential for awkwardness was immense, but this complexity was part of the appeal. It required skill, knowledge, and careful attention. It was a shared secret among the initiated. The language of flowers was a perfect metaphor for the Victorian era itself. On the surface, it was beautiful, romantic, and proper, but underneath that lovely exterior was a hidden world of complex, passionate, and sometimes dangerous messages. It was a way of speaking the truth, but speaking it in code, with a protective layer of plausible deniability. It was a testament to human ingenuity, to our ability to find ways to connect and communicate even when the rules of society try to keep us apart and silent. As you watch the young lady in the conservatory lift the small bouquet to her nose, inhaling the fragrance, her eyes meeting the young man's over the petals, you realize you are watching a conversation more honest and more intimate than any words they would be allowed to speak. The conservatory, with its coated flowers and whispered secrets, feels like a world in miniature, perfectly preserved under glass. But outside its fragile walls, the world is changing. In the long, seemingly endless era that gave it life is drawing to a close. We now find ourselves in the cold, grey dawn of January 22nd. 1901, a hush has fallen over London, and indeed, over the entire British Empire. On this day, after a reign of nearly 64 years, Queen Victoria died. It is difficult for us, in our fast-moving world, to comprehend the sheer magnitude of this event. For the vast majority of people alive at that moment, Victoria was the only monarch they had ever known. She wasn't just a queen, she was a permanent, unshakable fixture of their world, a symbol of an entire age. She had ascended to the throne as a young girl of 18 and had presided over an unprecedented period of industrial expansion, imperial conquest, and seismic social change. Her name was literally synonymous with the era. Her death felt less like the passing of a person and more like the end of time itself. You are standing in a crowd lining the streets of London, waiting for the funeral procession. The mood is somber, reflective. People are dressed in black. The sound of muffled church bells tolls in the distance. You look at the faces around you, old men with long, white beards who remember the Crimean War, middle-aged women in dark veils, the very picture of the angel in the house, and young people, perhaps even a new woman or two, who have only known a world defined by the Queen's strict, moralistic image. Victoria's own relationship with the themes we've been exploring was complex and, in some ways, deeply ironic. In her youth, she was deeply in love with her husband, Prince Albert. Theirs was a passionate, loving marriage, and she bore him 9 children. Her private diaries are filled with surprisingly candid and romantic entries about their life together. This is the great paradox of the Victorian age. It was named for a woman who, in her own private life, did not seem to be particularly Victorian in the passional, repressed sense of the word. However, after Albert's sudden death in 1861, she was plunged into a deep, prolonged grief from which she never truly emerged. She wore black for the rest of her life, for 40 years. It was during this long period of mourning that the image of Victoria as a stern, unsmiling, perpetually somber widow was cemented in the public imagination. She retreated from public life for many years, creating a power vacuum that, in some ways, allowed the moralistic, patriarchal values we associate with her name to flourish unchecked. Here's a fascinating, uncontroversial historical tidbit. In her later years, her closest companion was a Scottish servant named John Brown. Their relationship was intensely close and deeply affectionate, and it caused a huge scandal in the court. The exact nature of their relationship is still a subject of intense debate among historians. Were they just dear friends, or was it a secret? Late in life romance, her children certainly feared the latter and did their best to erase all evidence of him after her death. The widow of Windsor may have had her own final, secret chapter. The end of her reign felt like a psychological release. Her son, who became King Edward VII, was the polar opposite of his mother's public image. He was a lover of good food, fast horses, beautiful women, and high society. He was the jovial, pleasure-seeking gentleman personified. His ascension to the throne signaled a palpable shift in the nation's mood. The stuffy, moralistic atmosphere of the late Victorian era began to dissipate, replaced by the more flamboyant and less inhibited Edwardian period. It was like a long, tense breath was finally being let out. The change wasn't just symbolic. By 1901, the world was already a different place. The bicycle, the telephone, and the electric light were becoming commonplace. The new woman was a permanent fixture. The works of Sigmund Freud were about to be published, which would completely revolutionize the way people thought about sex and the unconscious mind. The social and technological forces that would define the 20th century were already in motion. Victoria's death was not the cause of this change, but the punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence. As the gun carriage bearing her coffin passes by, draped in the royal standard, you feel the immense weight of history. You are witnessing the funeral of a queen, but also the symbolic burial of an entire worldview. The rigid certainties, the suffocating proprieties, the carefully constructed facade of public morality, it all seemed to be passing away with her. The world was about to become faster, louder, and infinitely more complicated. The long, strange, contradictory 19th century was finally over. The 20th century had begun. The funeral procession has passed. The crowds are beginning to disperse. That you remain for a moment, letting the sense of an ending wash over you. The long Victorian night is over, and the Edwardian dawn is breaking. It's tempting to see this as a clean break, a moment when all the repression and hypocrisy were simply swept away. But history is never that neat. An era doesn't just end, it leaves behind a complicated and often messy legacy. It casts a long shadow, and the Victorian era, for all its strangeness, left a particularly powerful one. You're now in a position to look back and ask, what was the lasting impact of all this? What was the heritage of this world of double standards? The most immediate and obvious legacy was the hypocrisy itself. The Victorian era perfected the art of the double life. It taught generations of people, particularly men, to maintain a respectable public facade while pursuing a very different private reality. This idea that a man's private life was his own business, as long as it didn't cause a public scandal, became deeply ingrained in the culture. The image of the politician or businessman who champions family values in public while having secret affairs or hidden vices is a direct descendant of the Victorian gentleman who kept his copy of the Swell's Night Guide locked in his desk. This division between the public self and the private self, between what is said and what is done, became a defining feature of modern life. The medicalization of female emotions also had a long and damaging afterlife. While the diagnosis of hysteria eventually fell out of fashion, the underlying idea that women's emotional and psychological problems are rooted in their biology, in their hormones, or their reproductive systems, proved incredibly persistent. For much of the 20th century, women who expressed dissatisfaction, ambition, or anger were still likely to be dismissed as emotional or unstable. Their legitimate concerns translated into a personal, psychological failing. The ghost of the wandering womb haunted doctors' offices for a very long time. Then there's the deep-seated cultural anxiety about sex. The Victorians didn't invent sexual shame, but they certainly industrialized it. They wrapped it in science, anchored it in morality, and built an entire social structure around it. The idea that sex is inherently dirty, something to be hidden and not spoken of, became a powerful cultural inheritance. The awkward, fumbling conversations that parents have with their children about the birds and the bees, the continued controversy over sex education in schools, the way we still often use euphemisms to talk about our own bodies, all of this is a faint echo of the Victorian desire to cover the piano legs. However, the legacy is not all negative. Here's where the historical assessment becomes more nuanced. The Victorian era also gave birth to the very movements that would challenge its own worst impulses. Josephine Butler's campaign was a masterclass in political organization that laid the groundwork for the suffragettes. The new woman, for all the ridicule she faced, kicked open the doors to higher education and professional careers for women. The secret, clandestine communities of gay men and women, forged in the face of persecution, were the very first tentative seeds of the modern LGBTQ rights movement. Every act of rebellion, no matter how small, from publishing a pamphlet to riding a bicycle to choosing a flower, created a crack in the edifice of conformity. One of the most complex debates among historians today is how to judge the Victorians. Is it fair to apply our 21st century values to a society that operated with a completely different set of knowledge and beliefs? This is the problem of presentism. Some argue that we should try to understand them on their own terms, to see the world as they saw it. Others argue that while we must understand the context, we should not shy away from judging the brutal realities of their world, the misogyny, the hypocrisy, the exploitation. There is no easy answer. They were, after all, people of profound contradictions. They were sentimental and brutal, pious and hypocritical, innovators and traditionalists. You think back on your journey. You've been in the pristine parlor and the filthy alleyway. You've sat in the cold marriage bed in the sterile doctor's office. You've seen the public performance and the private transgression. And you realize that the most enduring legacy of the Victorian era is perhaps this very tension, this gap between the ideal and the real. They created an impossibly high standard of moral and sexual purity, a standard that no human being could possibly live up to. And in the vast, shadowy space between that impossible ideal and the messy reality of human nature, you find the real story of the Victorians. It's a story of secrets and silence, of hidden desires and quiet rebellions. And it's a story that, in many ways, we are still living out today. So here we are, at the end of our long night's journey. We've pulled back the heavy velvet curtains and let a little light into the darkest, most private corners of the Victorian world. We've seen that behind the mask of piety and propriety, there was a pulsing, complex, and deeply human world of desire, fear, and contradiction. The final act of our journey is to simply stand back and try to see the whole, unvarnished picture. Let's try to look beneath the public mask and see the real face of the era. What was that face? It was a face etched with anxiety. Anxiety about social status, about money, about health, about damnation. It was the anxiety of a society changing at a dizzying speed, where old certainties were crumbling anew. Frightening ideas were emerging. The steam engine was shrinking the world. Darwin was challenging God, and cities were swelling into monstrous, chaotic entities. The rigid obsession with rules, with propriety, with covering the table legs, was a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that felt like it was spinning out of control. It was a cultural coping mechanism. The face was also profoundly divided. We've seen the world of the angel in the house, a world of feminine purity and domestic sanctuary. And we've seen the world of the fallen woman, a world of commercial sex and social ruin. These were not just two different types of women, they were two sides of a single, fractured identity imposed upon all women. A woman was either a Madonna or a whore, with very little room in between. This impossible dichotomy was the central lie of the era, a lie that warped the lives of both men and women. Men were taught to split their desires, to seek purity in a wife and pleasure from a prostitute, ensuring that true, whole intimacy was almost impossible in either relationship. But the most striking feature of the face beneath the mask is its humanity. It's easy to mock the Victorians for their absurdities or condemn them for their hypocrisy. It's easy to see them as stuffy, two-dimensional figures in old, sepia-toned photographs. But they were as real and as complicated as we are. They fell in love. They felt lonely. They struggled with their desires. They worried about the future. The woman diagnosed with hysteria wasn't just a quaint historical curiosity. She was a real person suffering from what we would now likely call clinical depression or anxiety, trapped in a world that had no language for her pain. The young man frequenting a brothel wasn't just a moral reprobate, he was perhaps a lonely, confused individual navigating a world of profound sexual confusion. Here's one last, small detail that speaks volumes. It's about the secret diaries and letters that have been so crucial to our understanding of this hidden world. So many of them are filled with a desperate need to confess, to record the truth of their lives, even if no one else would ever see it. They wrote in code. They used invisible ink. They hid their journals in secret compartments. There was a powerful, driving need to say, "This is who I really am. This is what I really feel." This, perhaps, is the most human impulse of all, the desire to be known. Historians will forever continue to debate the nuances of this period. Was the Victorian miracle of industrial progress built on a foundation of profound social misery? Did the era's emphasis on family and morality create stability? Or did it just breed hypocrisy and private despair? These aren't easy questions, and the answers are rarely black and white. The story of the Victorians is not a simple morality play. It's a sprawling, messy, human drama. As we finally draw the curtains on this journey, the picture that remains is one of a society at war with itself. It was an age of incredible progress and profound repression, of public piety and private license, of scientific advancement and deep-seated superstition. It was an era that tried, with all its might, to deny the fundamental, messy, and often contradictory nature of human desire, and in its spectacular, fascinating failure to do so, it revealed more about that desire than any more liberated age ever could. It showed us that the more you try to suppress a part of human nature, the more powerfully and strangely it will re-emerge in the dark. This story is over now. The gas lights of that old, forgotten London have been extinguished, and the figures we met tonight, the angel, the courtesan, the doctor, the new woman, have all receded back into the soft, quiet folds of history. The frantic, noisy, anxious energy of their world has faded away, leaving only a gentle silence in its wake. You can feel the tension in your own mind begin to release. like a tightly wound spring slowly uncoiling. Let the details of their lives drift away like smoke, leaving just a feeling of distance, of time stretching out long and deep behind you. You're floating now, in that peaceful, quiet space between the story and the dream. There are no more rules to follow, no more secrets to uncover. There is only the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, a soft and steady anchor in the stillness of the night. You're safe in your bed, far away from that world of courses and anxieties. Just allow yourself to sink a little deeper into the mattress, to feel the weight of your own body becoming heavy and relaxed. Let the last thoughts of the day dissolve into murmurs, and then into nothing at all. You are drifting on a calm, dark river, and it is carrying you gently towards a deep and restful sleep. The end of the article. Good night.